So Sheila Liston here with us today is the Manager, Public Administration Sectors and Specialist Services team, is with the Public Administration Sectors and Specialized Services team at WorkSafeNB. During her 20-year career with WorkSafeNB, Sheila has worked closely with stakeholders in multiple roles. She supported the occupational rehabilitation of injured workers in a coordination role with WorkSafeNB's Rehabilitation Center. During her years in case management, Sheila's work focused on client service, helping injured workers and employers navigate recovery from injury and return to work. As a manager within WorkSafeNB's claim management department, Sheila currently leads a team of dedicated case managers who manage work-related injury claims for public sector employees and work-related traumatic psychological injury claims. Sheila strongly believes in the importance of psychological safety and is involved in initiatives to improve the psychological well-being of her colleagues. Sheila holds a BSc in psychology from the University of New Brunswick and has a certificate in tribunal administrative justice from the Foundation of Administrative Justice. So thank you for being here with us today, Sheila. And Andy West, who's here joining her, is an occupational therapist with WorkSafeNB with extensive experience in occupational therapy. Andy has dedicated his career to helping individuals recover from work-related injuries and regain their independence. Andy is interested in proactive approaches to rehabilitation, particularly in challenging current client beliefs regarding diagnosis and function. He believes in empowering clients to take an active role in their own recovery and working collaboratively to develop personalized treatment plans. So thank you, Andy, also for joining us, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so much. All right, just let me get my presentation up here. Okay, can you see my presentation?
I can see it, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to come here and talk to you about some of WorkSafeNB's early intervention programs for our injured workers. And specifically, I'm pleased to be here to talk about our Succeed program, which is our early intervention program for traumatic psychological injuries. So before I get into the actual program, I'd like to just give you a little bit of background on WorkSafe New Brunswick and traumatic psychological injuries, just a little bit of a history, one slide on numbers, and just some general information on traumatic psychological injuries. And after that, I'll move into what our challenge was, what the program's about, and where we're headed next. So first of all, what is a traumatic psychological injury? Essentially, it's a psychological injury that results from experiencing or even witnessing a traumatic event. Some examples might be a retail worker who experiences a robbery at work, a correctional officer who witnesses a violent attack by an inmate or experiences a violent attack from an inmate, or a paramedic who attends multiple motor vehicle accidents, some cause involving serious injuries or death over his or her career. Of course, claim decisions at WorkSafe New Brunswick are guided by New Brunswick's Workers' Compensation Act, so the body of legislation, as well as WorkSafeNB policy. What's critical to understand is that for WorkSafeNB, for that claim, that psychological injury claim to be accepted, we have to have a psychological injury that's resulted from a traumatic event that occurred at work. And the worker may experience one or more traumatic events. The number really isn't critical to us. What's critical is that the traumatic event occurred at work. And one question we often receive is what is, or how do you define what is traumatic? And for us, what we do is we look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or some of you might know it as a DSM. This is the same manual that's used by the psychologists and psychiatrists that work with us in diagnosing our injured workers. And we use the definition that that manual has for a traumatic event, and that is what we have in our policy. The Workers' Compensation Act also has a presumptive clause for emergency workers. And in the Act, it defines an emergency worker as a police officer, firefighter, or paramedic. And what this presumptive clause states is that if any of the workers in one of these professions is diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, specifically that diagnosis, we presume that PTSD or that post-traumatic stress disorder arose out of in the course of employment. So now just on some numbers, and this will be my only slide where I talk about statistics and data. I just wanted here to have a little bit of time explaining to you or just showing you the volume of claims relative to, or the volume of psychological claims relative to all claims that we have at WorkSafe New Brunswick. Our traumatic psychological injury claims actually make up a very small portion of the overall claim volume that we have. This data you see on your screen is from 2022, and at that time it was approximately 2% of overall claims were traumatic psychological injury claims. Yet at the same time, if you look over in the right-hand column, you'll see the open claim duration, which is essentially the time off work for these injured workers, or the time that they're disabled from their injury. And you see that is quite a bit higher for psychological injury claims than it is for other regular injuries, such as physical injuries, fractures, strains, and different types of injuries like that. So this is, of course, significant to us. It means that these injured workers who have traumatic psychological injuries, that they're dealing with the troubling effects of their injury, such as severe symptoms, a decrease in their everyday functioning for an extended period of time. And it kind of speaks to, what can we do from a case management perspective? What can we do from a WorkSafeNB's perspective to try to help support injured workers with a traumatic psychological injury? So in years gone past, case managers at WorkSafe New Brunswick, they were assigned caseloads or claims based on geographical region. So for example, a case manager who lived and worked in the northwest region of the province would be assigned claims of injured workers who also lived and worked in the northwest region of the province. Similar in the northeast, southeast, and southwest of the province of New Brunswick. What that meant was that those case managers would have a variety of different types of injury claims on their caseload, some of which may include a traumatic psychological injury claim. However, they may have very few of those, and they may go for long periods of time without having any type of traumatic psychological injury claim on their caseload. In 2018, the Auditor General provided WorkSafeNB with a report. And in that report, they had met with us examining multiple factors. And one area that they recommended was around how we actually assign claims to case managers. The Auditor General asked that we look at and consider assigning claims based on injury, specifically for complex or sensitive conditions, such as traumatic psychological injuries. This is actually being done at other boards currently. And the intention behind this change was that case managers working with a specific type of injury could develop a better subject matter expertise in that area, so they become more proficient with working with those types of injuries and assisting injured workers and employers in the recovery from those injuries. So we embrace this recommendation. And we created a small team of case managers in 2019. And this group of case managers is dedicated to managing only traumatic psychological injury claims. In addition to focusing on the traumatic psychological injury claim, this team of case managers also work closely together. So they connect with each other daily. They share their experiences, their learnings. They're doing peer-to-peer support. And while having a dedicated team has allowed us for these types of opportunities of specific professional development and peer-to-peer coaching, having all the traumatic psychological injury claims on the same team has also put a spotlight on some of the daily challenges that we are facing in trying to help injured workers with these types of injuries. So one of the challenges that we're looking at is actually access to treatment. Now, access to mental health treatment is limited not just for WorkSafe New Brunswick, but also for other organizations and agencies. We're certainly not alone in this. Our treatment providers often have very long wait lists if they're taking new clients at all. We also know that not all treatment providers are experienced or trained in delivering trauma treatment specifically. So as a result, our injured workers could wait several weeks, sometimes even months potentially, to start appropriate treatment and that will help them in their recovery. These delays can have a significant impact on the injured worker as well as their family members and their employers. The injured worker wouldn't be getting the support they need to try to recover. From an employer perspective, their injured employee is actually off work longer. It can be very frustrating for family members and friends to be seeing the injured worker continue to be suffering and having difficulty. And it's equally frustrating for our case managers as they're trying to provide support and care to the injured worker and arrange the services they need. The other risk here is that the injured worker's symptoms can actually worsen over time as they wait for treatment. And this will add complexity to the claim. And of course, it will also contribute to the worker needing more treatment and being off work longer. So what we did to look at this is we decided to strike a project team with multiple staff from different parts of the organization. So we had staff from adjudication, claims management, we had some of our clinical staff, psychology consultant, occupational therapy, as well as project management to really look at this challenge and try to come up with a solution. And our solution that eventually they arrived on was actually the Succeed program. So specifically what the Succeed program is an early intervention program dedicated to treatment of the traumatic psychological injury. It's based on a few different principles. One is that we want the treatment to be evidence-based. We also want it to be trauma-focused. So we want it to be focused on the injurer's actual injury, the traumatic psychological injury. We wanted the program to be as accessible as possible to as many workers as possible. And we also wanted to focus on early access to the program. So we didn't want the injured worker to have to be delayed or wait an extended period of time to get into the program. And I'm going to speak a little bit further about that last bit, the early access. So within workers' compensation, essentially, we fund treatment that's related to the accepted claim injury, which essentially means we first have to make a decision to accept the injury. And then after that, we make a decision to fund treatment for the accepted injury. This can cause a challenge when we're looking at a program like Succeed, because we have to wait for the traumatic psychological injury to be accepted in the claim before we could technically provide treatment or provide the Succeed program to the injured worker. There are delays in adjudication. Our adjudication team has done some really great progress in trying to address those delays. However, they are experiencing delays where the injured worker may need to wait several weeks in order to get that decision about the traumatic psychological injury claim acceptance. So the treatment or the project team, in looking at this, really wanted to take a different approach. And they wanted to see if it was possible to offer the Succeed program to the injured worker during the adjudication process, which means that we would potentially be offering the program to injured workers before we had actually made a decision to accept the traumatic psychological injury. There is a bit of risk with this approach. WorkSafe New Brunswick is funded 100% by the employers of New Brunswick, and our employers expect us to spend their money prudently and to spend their money on work-related injuries. So the project team started looking at the data, and we tried to look to see, could we find that sweet spot where we could offer the program to as many workers as possible while also minimizing the risk to the employer. And after looking at the data, the project team determined that the tested traumatic event, which I had previously mentioned on another slide, was actually that key area where we could look at. So as long as the claim was most likely related to a traumatic event, we could offer the Succeed program. The majority of claims where we had already made that decision went on to actually being accepted later on. So we felt that the risk was actually quite low to the employer and would allow as many injured workers as possible to access this program. So next, I'll get into a little bit more about what the Succeed program is about. So first, before I go there, I'm going to talk a little bit about the name. So why the name Succeed? The team discussed several different names for the program. In the end, they settled on Succeed, or Réussir in French. And the rationale behind this is that we felt that these two names actually embody a lot of the values and the characteristics and the goals that we're trying to achieve. The team really liked that each letter of the name is tied to an important characteristic and value related to the program. And what was actually equally important to us was that because New Brunswick is Canada's only officially bilingual province, we wanted the name to work equally well in French and English. And when we looked at Réussir to Succeed and looked at how we could establish those values, we felt that we could establish similar values that would be embodied in both names. And for this, we really want to thank our communications team at WorkSafe New Brunswick, which also includes our translators. They were a great help to us in trying to come up with this name and make sure it works in both of our official languages. So the Succeed program, as I mentioned before, it is evidence-based, trauma-focused, and it's also a structured program. It is 6 sessions delivered over 6 weeks, so approximately 1 session per week. Each session is approximately 1.5 hours in length. It is based on an approach used by Dr. Tim Black, who's a leading Canadian specialist in workplace trauma, and he's based out of British Columbia. Dr. Black also was, in addition to providing us a framework for the program and some of the background for it, he also provided training to both our Succeed service providers, as well as an information session to WorkSafeNB staff. So I'm not a clinician, and I'm not going to go into great detail about what the actual program overview looks like. I'll just try to give you a bit of a summary so you can understand the different phases of the program and what would be covered. So in phase 1, the injured worker would be educated on the traumatic psychological injury, so the psychoeducation, and they'd also be provided with tools for self-regulation. These tools will later be used in phase 2. What this does in phase 1 is it helps the injured worker normalize their common reactions to trauma and learn not to avoid trauma. In phase 2, it helps the worker develop a structured process to work through traumatic events and learn skills to work through future traumatic events. So the injured worker will actually work through one traumatic event with the service provider, learning the importance of exposure and managing their emotions, and practicing the skills that they've learned in phase 1. And then phase 3 is about reconnection. This is about helping the worker develop the skills to reconnect to other people, including possibly people at their workplace, and to continue to work through other traumatic events that they've learned through the skills they've already learned. The service providers that provide Succeed have specific expectations. Specifically, they are social workers or licensed counseling therapists. They do have to apply to the program and they have to complete training for the program before they can actually begin therapy or begin treating our clients. The program is available in French and English. It can also be conducted virtually or in person. So if a specific service provider isn't available where a certain client lives, if they have access to a computer for a virtual connection, then we will connect them with a service provider elsewhere in the province so that they can also get the program. If they're currently receiving mental health treatment, they don't have to stop the mental health treatment to actually attend Succeed and benefit from Succeed. Just remember that Succeed is a 6-week program, so we certainly do not want to disconnect anyone from the treatment providers that they've been currently working with, so they can certainly attend Succeed and continue with the treatment that they're currently getting. In addition, the question comes up as to what happens after Succeed. So for injured workers, as I mentioned, we offer this program before their claim's been accepted. If it should happen that the claim is not accepted, the injured worker is still allowed to complete the full 6-week course of treatment, and we will pay for that. However, at that point, we would not be able to fund any other treatment because their claim has been disallowed. For workers where their claim has been accepted and we have accepted the traumatic psychological injury, their claim would then be transferred off to a case manager who would work with the client, the injured worker, and the service provider to determine the next steps in their treatment program. Oops, sorry, wrong mic. So what's next for Succeed? Succeed was launched in June of 2022, so it just passed its 1-year birthday from implementation. We're currently gathering data to begin a data review and analysis of the program. Our Succeed service providers are required to conduct pre and post functional outcome measures. So we'll be looking at how Succeed impacts the worker's symptoms, as well as hopefully looking at some return to work outcome data. As well, we want to look at our client satisfaction data. Right now, we recognize that we do have, as mentioned, we have a smaller sample of TPI claims or traumatic psychological injury claims that are accepted at WorkSafe New Brunswick. So it may take a little bit of time for us to build up a sufficient sample size in order to be able to deliver this data. But we were really excited to actually start looking at it now and start seeing if we could see any trends or conclusions that can help us in furthering develop the next steps to help our injured workers at New Brunswick. And that is the end of my session. So I can take questions now, or if you'd like, we can move on to Andy West and we can take questions at the end.
I'm good with either, Sheila. Great job, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Sharon
Do we,
here, I have to get used to using Zoom.
do we want to wait till the end, or what do you think?
Amber, were there any questions that have come up?
One moment, I do see one thing in the Q&A, so I can bring that up now if we'd like.
Sure.
Yeah, so question from Peter Ross, do you have a maximum duration of therapy or number of sessions before consolidation?
That's a very specific clinical question. And I'm guessing, is this about treatment in general as opposed to the Succeed program?
It says ballpark.
Off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to answer that right now. I'd have to go look up our data. Again, like this is the Succeed program is 6 sessions. After that, it would really depend on the client's needs. We do have clients that have been able to start return to work planning following Succeed program. We've also have other clients that have needed other treatment, either single service with psychologist or looking at multidisciplinary intensive treatment. So it is a little difficult to give you an actual number because it does vary quite a bit. Yep.
Gotcha. Well, thank you anyway. Those are the only questions that I had waiting in the Q&A. If anybody had anything in the meantime, feel free to chime in now. Otherwise, we can move forward. I don't see anything coming in.
Awesome. I'll get my presentation up and running. Okay, just to confirm, folks can see the presentation, but not my notes, right?
Yes, I can see your slideshow, but I don't see your notes slide.
Excellent. And yeah, thanks, Amber, for the introduction earlier. I'm an occupational therapist with WorkSafeNB, and my presentation will be focused on how WorkSafeNB's Working to Well program supports injured worker well-being. So during this presentation, my hope is that folks become aware of what is the Working to Well program, what is the role of the injured worker, what is the role of the employer, what are modified duties, and then we'll finish with a case study with the intention of tying everything together. So the Working to Well tool focuses on guiding return to work planning and activity modification from the time of a worker's injury to the completion of the injured worker's rehabilitation and reintegration to their pre-accident employment. And this is important because there is a strong correlation between attachment to work and the prevention of prolonged disability. Creating a successful return to work program requires a team effort. So strong partnerships must be present for a return to work program to function optimally, and each partner must clearly understand their role and responsibilities. When all partners work together to share their knowledge and expertise, a return to work program will generally run smoothly and efficiently. So as you can see on this slide, the Working to Well partners include employers, workers, healthcare providers, union representatives if applicable, and WorkSafeNB staff. And this can be quite broad, but can include a case manager, a medical advisor, occupational therapist, physiotherapist, social worker, and others if appropriate. The most important aspect about this team effort, in my experience, is that the injured worker feels supported and that all parties are on the same page. So this doesn't mean that there can't be disagreements and compromises when planning a return to work program, but that all parties clearly understand and accept the expectations and rationale behind the plan. The image that I've included on this slide is a screenshot from the Working to Well website, and you can interact with the website to learn more about each team member by clicking on their icons. On the very last slide of this presentation, I've included a link, but what I was thinking as well when I was watching the other presentations is at the conclusion of my presentation, I think I'll just include the links to the Working to Well in the chat. So understanding the role of the injured worker in return to work planning. If a worker experiences an injury in the workplace, it is paramount that the worker notifies their employer and that the proper documentation is completed by both the worker and the employer. This will ensure that no matter how big or small the injury, that there will be documentation to support the injury and claim with WorkSafeNB. It is also the role of the injured worker to actively participate in healthcare treatment to promote a safe recovery. So this could range from physiotherapy to medical consultations with specialists to cooperating in the return to work program itself. Oftentimes, the injured worker is consulted on how to best organize their return to work program as the worker is knowledgeable about their employment and job site. The injured worker can provide suggestions on how to safely modify duties in their specific workplace. The injured worker should also keep in touch with their WorkSafeNB case manager and their employer. As I discussed on the last slide, communication is key to success, and it's important to report both successes and issues the injured worker may be facing. And last but not least, although it's not mandatory, it's also encouraged for the injured worker to stay in touch with coworkers while off of work to maintain meaningful connections with the workplace. Benefits of injured worker actively participating in the recovery plan. If the injured worker is actively involved in their rehabilitation plan, they have a sense of ownership and responsibility regarding their recovery. So the injured worker likely feels a sense of purpose and is not only physically active when attending appointments like physiotherapy, but also emotionally connected to coworkers and the workplace. The injured worker can also contribute to some of the appropriate decision-making processes, such as when and where they receive their treatment, which can minimize the impact that their injury has on the worker and also their family. By shifting the focus from what the worker can't do to what they safely can do in the workplace, it can help the worker feel increased value that they can still contribute within the workplace in meaningful ways despite their injury. Understanding the role of the employer in return to work planning. The employer plays a really big role when a worker is injured. Just as it is important for the worker to be an active participant in the return to work process, it's crucial that the employer is actively involved as well. So employers should stay connected with injured workers throughout the recovery process to show that they are valued and to help them retain a connection to the workplace. The employer should also offer meaningful and productive modified duties or other suitable work that is safe and within the worker's capabilities. It's also important for the employer to be flexible and tailor a return to work plan to meet the worker's individual needs. A great feature of the Working to Well program is the Employer's Quick Guide. This is a helpful guide that is available for download on the Working to Well website, and I'll link this as well at the end of the presentation. Within the quick guide are prompts to assist employers in identifying early and safe return to work options for workers with injuries. And an example of this would be if an injured worker was working within a labor sector, early and safe return to work options could include organizing parts and materials within the job site or reviewing and updating process manuals. Oftentimes, employers aren't trained on just how diverse modified duties can be, and so the quick guide can be quite helpful to provide examples. The Employer's Quick Guide also includes a template for an early return to work plan. And for those that aren't familiar, this would include sections about how many hours the injured worker will be working per day, how many days per week they'll be working, what duties they may be completing, when to take symptom management breaks, what their symptom management breaks should consist of. So for example, specific physiotherapy stretches, how long and where to apply an ice pack, and more. The quick guide is very useful for most employers within this province of New Brunswick. So as you've likely guessed by this point in the presentation, modified duties can be quite diverse. Due to the vagueness of the term, both employers and employees can struggle to determine what is appropriate for an injured worker to complete while in the workplace while recovering from an injury. As I've already mentioned, the Working to Well program lays a strong foundation for how an injured worker and the employer can work together to determine how best to get an injured worker back through the doors in meaningful, productive, and most importantly, safe ways. These modified duties are temporary and progressive throughout the injured worker's recovery. For example, if a worker has injured their knee and cannot currently flex their knee, they may not be able to complete low-level tasks until their knee movement has improved. Once it is safe to do so, the injured worker may progress to occasional low-level tasks until their endurance for an increased frequency in low-level work is appropriate. To determine what modified duties are appropriate, a functional assessment can be used. This is often completed by a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist, and an easy example of why functional assessments are useful is if an injured worker demonstrates the ability to safely lift 10 pounds and their job requires them to lift 50 pounds, communication between all of the relevant stakeholders must be completed to determine what safe modified duties the worker can safely complete that are 10 pounds or less. So as I mentioned above, the modified duties are temporary and progressive, and so the worker would be reevaluated as appropriate based on their injury, and eventually the 10 pounds temporary weight restriction would increase to something like 20 pounds, for example, and then eventually back to 50 pounds. And no two injuries are the same, so this process may not be linear and can differ from worker to worker. In some cases, a worker may recover quickly and is confident in their abilities to handle their pre-accident duties safely in a short period of time. In other cases, the injured worker may require a very structured plan in increasing weights, frequencies, and tolerances, which requires strong communication for all involved. I think it's important to note as well that an occupational therapist like myself may also be used to help facilitate return to work planning. So in certain situations, a WorkSafeNB case manager may refer for an occupational therapist to assist in developing and progressing a return to work plan. However, this is not always necessary, and the Working to Well tool can be safely and successfully used without an occupational therapist involved. So, why are modified duties so important? They're meaningful, productive, and progressive for the injured worker, their coworkers, and their employer, and contribute to an early and more successful return to work approach. I thought it would be important to note that the Working to Well program fits really well with WorkSafe New Brunswick's strategic plan as a whole. As you can see, WorkSafe NB's vision is to make New Brunswick the safest place to work, and the mission is to collaborate with all stakeholders to design, build, and manage an effective continuum of safety and care. And I think this couldn't be more appropriate when looking at how the Working to Well tool was designed. So now for a case study. How does the Working to Well program assist in injured worker well-being? In my made-up scenario, Miss Smith is 46 years old, works at a long-term care facility as a licensed practical nurse, and unfortunately sustained a shoulder strain injury about a month ago. What has already been done, and where do we go from here? So let's dig in. Miss Smith and her employer completed the required documentation for WorkSafeNB, and she has been assigned a case manager. Due to her injury, she couldn't immediately complete any lighter modified duties, such as bedside companionship or resident grooming. However, she has maintained contact with her employer and coworkers and has been attending local physiotherapy 3 times weekly for the last 3 weeks. She is feeling stronger and her range of motion has improved. Miss Smith, her employer, her physiotherapist, and her case manager are in agreement that she is ready to return to work, completing modified duties. She completes a functional assessment, and her physiotherapist sends the information to Miss Smith's case manager. Her case manager consults with the employer to organize a return to work planning meeting. The meeting is held and Ms. Smith's case manager shares her functional abilities with the employer. Ms. Smith reports that she feels confident she can complete light level care, which includes vitals check, wound care, IV care, medication passes, charting, and feeding the residents. These duties are determined to be appropriate based upon Ms. Smith's functional abilities, as well as based on her injury, her current progress in rehabilitation, and her pre-accident job demands, plus the modified duties available in her workplace. Using the Working to Well Employer's Quick Guide template, it is organized that Ms. Smith will complete these duties 3 days a week, so Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, for example, for 4 hours a shift. Ms. Smith's physiotherapist is able to see her on Tuesdays and Thursdays, reducing her physiotherapy cadence to twice per week, while allowing her to actively participate in a meaningful, safe, and productive modified return to work. During Ms. Smith's rehabilitation process, she has been an active participant. There has been strong communication and collaboration from all stakeholders throughout her rehabilitation. By taking her needs and preferences into consideration, her well-being has been positively impacted. In conclusion, this presentation on Working to Well has focused on the Working to Well tool developed and used by WorkSafeNB. I'm hopeful that the audience can see how the tool positively supports injured worker well-being. And like I mentioned, I'll stop sharing, but I'll save the link to Working to Well in the chat right now as well.
Wonderful, thanks. And if you don't have permission to message all the attendees, I might ask our Zoom support to just repost that link if you want to share it with us, and then
Good
we
idea.
can have it reposted so that everybody else can access it as well. Thank you both so much for your presentation. We have a good 10 minutes or so for questions. So if anybody has questions for either Andy or Sheila, feel free to post them in the Q&A. To get started, I would love to ask the two of you. So a lot of what we've been talking about so far has been focused on prevention of harm, but the nature of WorkSafe's work is a lot of the time you're interacting with people after the harm has already been done. So in your experience, what have employers done that has been more successful, or what have been some barriers to actually supporting that employee and coming back to work? Because that can sometimes be a difficult and daunting process.
Do you want me to go first?
You go first, Sheila. Yeah, great.
And maybe what I'll do is I'll speak a little bit to maybe what WorkSafe has done as an employer. As a manager, I'm also an employer as well. So we specifically around psychological health and safety, it has become, I guess, an important topic at WorkSafe New Brunswick over the past few years, where we've begun really looking at what do our own employees need to help prevent psychological health and safety and ensure their psychological well-being at work. So we've been actually looking quite strongly at what do our employees need, what tools are missing, what tools do they need. We've been striking a few project groups actually to start looking at this. So actually involving our frontline employees to give us feedback about where they feel the gaps are and what they feel would be helpful, and having them work collaboratively with management and leadership to start developing tools to help support them long term. And I think also it goes to speak, you have to look at your culture. What is your workplace culture around psychological health and safety? Is it important? And I think those are important questions that we're asking also at WorkSafe, and also trying to ensure that we look at that. So kind of speak for all employers? No, but speak as an employer at WorkSafe New Brunswick, I think we're really trying to pay attention to that and trying to support our own employees to ensure that they are feeling safe at work.
Great, great answer, Sheila, and good question, Amber, too. I guess like the Working to Well tool itself is really aimed at a supportive approach where collaboration is crucial and communication is crucial. So you want to hear the worker's voice, right? You want to work collaboratively with all the stakeholders. So I think that it's a good starting point anyways to kind of change that narrative that, you know, we work for WorkSafe New Brunswick and we're aware that that narrative exists as well. And we don't like it, right? We want to help people. So I think hopefully with all these initiatives, that'll improve too.
Great, thank you so much. I've got a question here from the Q&A. Krista Chase is wondering, how does Working to Wellness's modified return to work look for those with workplace-related trauma?
I guess it kind of combines a bit of Sheila's success program as well with the Working to Well, because yeah, it is a bit more tailored for purely physical injuries, and it would depend on the severity of the psychological trauma as well. So I guess a little bit of a broken record here, but really having a strong partnership with the client. If they've been seeing a therapist through the Succeed program, making sure that all parties are on the same side and making sure that confidentiality is taken into consideration as well when starting that return to work program, if appropriate, right? So it's a little bit of that cheesy answer of communication, right? Making sure the workers and is on the same page as everybody else and making sure their voice is heard as well.
Great, thank you so much. I'm wondering, so for psychological harm specifically that has happened at work that causes anxiety or distress or other barriers to mental wellness, but isn't necessarily diagnosable as trauma or workplace trauma, what other options and services might be available to people and to their employers?
So yeah, I think I mean, obviously, you know, some employees may actually receive the Succeed program. As I mentioned, we offer pre-adjudication, so a few of those claims will be disallowed, and so the worker will, you know, will have to go back to a non-WorkSafeNB funding. But there are different options out there. Would be your own EFAP provider or employee family assistance provider, I believe. It could also be Blue Cross. There may be some other supports in there that we would really encourage workers and employers to explore together with the employee to try to determine, you know, what would be the most appropriate thing. What is the employee comfortable in accessing? But those would be the main funders. There are long wait times to get into the Medicare system, unfortunately. So, you know, not really probably the best option for someone who's looking for support or help. So certainly you would look for those other private funders to see if your employee can get access that way. And, you know, your HR team may have some ideas themselves. They may have some other thoughts about different types of wellness programs or things like that that you could potentially access. So certainly would encourage, you know, the utilization of those other supports within your organization to try to support your employees in their recovery if it is not a workplace trauma.
Great, thank you. And again, if anybody has any other questions in the chat, we have a little bit of time left with Andy and Sheila. I'll just ask, I have one last question myself for you folks. And you had mentioned that this psychological health and safety conversation has been like really important in the last couple of years. And from what I've noticed, it's become very prevalent in the last couple of years, kind of suddenly, whereas previously it really wasn't a discussion in terms of workplace health and safety. It was really focused on that sense of physical health and safety. So I'm wondering, from your perspectives as regulators and as professionals working in this field, what kinds of conversations and strategies have been useful in, you know, impressing upon people the importance of psychological health and safety and why this conversation is now being part of the framework?
I think in terms of like conversations, I mean, what we're doing at WorkSafe New Brunswick is a lot of it's happening on a case-by-case basis with the individual employers, trying to educate the individual employers about psychological health and safety as we're trying to help the worker with a traumatic psychological injury return to work. So trying to answer their questions, help them understand the symptoms, the trauma, whatnot, within what we can. Obviously, we are limited due to confidentiality, so there are things we cannot share, but we do try our best to try to educate the individual employers about it and to help support them, support their employees. And Andy did a really good job when he was talking about the importance of communication. I mean, I can't stress enough that communicating with your employees and having good communication with them is so critical to helping the worker, whether it be from a psychological injury or a physical injury, just feel that they're missed when they're off work, that they're valued by their employer, that you want them back. and that they're wanted, that, you know, that they're present, that their absence is actually, you know, is actually something that is something noticed by the organization and by their teammates and by their direct supervisor. So I think it's important that, like again, you mentioned that communication is really critical. You know, even potentially trying to involve them in things maybe aren't work related. You know, if there's some team issue or some team event coming up, that maybe you can include them in so that they feel included, they still feel part of your team, and they still feel that, yeah, these people care about me and they want me to get better and want me to get back to work. Those feelings are very, very important in anyone's recovery. So I can't stress enough the, you know, that importance of it.
I think that's great. And I just have like an opinion on it. This isn't WorkSafeNB's official stance, right? But I think this is a broader subject that's getting more attention as of late anyways, right? In the working world in North America, maybe even broader, right? Like I think psychological well-being maybe has been on the back burner, and I'm glad it's getting the attention and focus that it deserves. So hopefully there's more focus on this moving forward. And it is really important, right? We're humans. We have complex emotions and everyone's different. Everyone wants to feel supported, right? And I think that actually ultimately helps the outcome and the workplace culture too in a workplace.
It does. Yeah. I think it's all linked. You can't separate one from the other. So, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, it absolutely is all connected. I think that's been like a running thread throughout what has been discussed today, is that really you can't look at taking care of your employees without looking at the psychological wellness element of it. So thank you both so much for your presentation. Much appreciated.